Let's turn this old faux leather jacket into a one-of-a-kind bucket bag. This jacket was gifted to me for upcycling as it just ended up being unworn and unwanted. The style itself is not too bad, although maybe not my personal style. However, unfortunately the faux leather is very damaged around the neck area and has previously been attempted to be repaired, but the damage still is very noticeable, and due to the nature of the fabric, the only thing that could actually save this piece is replacing this part altogether. So for me, this is enough reason to chop it apart and make something completely new out of it. I start by taking the jacket apart to see how much material I got to work with and whether I will need to do any patchworking. Most parts of the jacket I just cut apart. However, where there was no top stitching, I actually switched to my seam ripper, hoping it'll leave me with more usable material. I then started tracing my pattern piece, which I did have to patchwork, so I am working with one half of the pattern. The other half of my piece I ended up slicing into 3 different pieces, so the first thing we of course do is sew them together, for which I'm using a leather needle. I sew my patches right sides together with 1 cm seam allowance and then top stitch that seam allowance to both sides of the seam, making sure I catch it on the other side so it will look nice and lay flat. I do this with all my pieces until my patchwork half is fully assembled, and then attach that with the same principle to the not patchworked half to create one big side piece for my bag. Using my side pieces, I then trace my lining fabric. This way I'm making sure it matches exactly. I choose lining fabric that perfectly matches my bag because the lining will be pretty visible from the outside. To start assembling the bag, we now need to attach the lining to the outer side along the handle hole in the middle, for which we just sew along the opening. Once we have done that, we can carefully cut the matching hole into our lining piece. Now we need to pull the lining through the hole so that the wrong sides are touching, and then top stitch the hole to give it a nice crisp finish. I used about half a centimeter seam allowance for this and took my time to make sure it's nice and clean afterwards and that the lining does not overhang the leather. We are doing all of the steps twice because we have 2 bag sides. We can now use one of the side pieces to trace its shape onto some wadding to give the bag extra stability. So technically this is optional, and you could, for example, also use some strong interfacing. I, however, recommend this step whether you use wadding or interfacing to give the bag its shape, as otherwise it'll just look like a tote bag. The wadding can be about 4 cm shorter than the overall side piece, as we are going to create corners for the width of the bag, and that would be a little more challenging to do if it includes the wadding. Generally, the wadding should be about 2 cm smaller than the side pieces of the bag on each side, as we don't want the wadding to include any of the seam allowance. We can then sandwich the wadding between the lining and outer pieces. To actually start assembling the bag, we place both side pieces right sides together and attach only the faux leather layers along the sides. I opted to also top stitch down those seams, A, for a clean look, and B, for it to match with the rest of the bag. At this stage, I decided to overlock the top edges of my lining piece because the fabric was fraying quite a lot, so that will make the next steps easier. The wadding needs to be sort of quilted and attached to the lining, as otherwise it keeps pushing up and would be visible from the outside of the bag. For this, I basically just stitched away from the handle hole along the lining, almost making it look like a sun with sun rays. To close the lining, I am burrito rolling the bag, so rolling one side in, encasing the roll with the other side of the lining pieces, and sew them right sides together. I pull the bag out of its little burrito and repeat the step on the other side too. We can now close the bottom of the bag. For this, we turn the bag wrong sides out and close only the faux leather bottom. Now we can give the bag its boxy shape by pulling the 2 sides slightly apart, grab the corners and fold a little triangle at the bottom, pin and sew this, and afterwards measure the length of our seam to repeat exactly the same step on the other side, making sure the length of the seam matches, as we want it to be symmetrical. We will need to repeat those steps for the lining. For this, we have to pull the lining away from the bag, close the bottom line, and then also fold the triangles and stitch them in place just like we did before. We can now turn the bag right sides out, and the very last thing we need to do is to close the top edge. My wadding was slightly too big, so I gave it a quick trim. To make the next step easier, I'm folding my overlocked lining edge over and just stitch this down. Next, I fold the leather edge over and pin it to the lining to close and top stitch the entire top of the bag. I am again using 1/2 centimeter seam allowance, and with that we have finished the transformation from an old damaged leather jacket to a new and super unique bucket bag. This is definitely one of my favorite bags I have ever made, just because you don't see this type of style very often and it just looks so elegant yet kind of edgy. It's got a bit of a vintage vibe which I am just obsessed with. The patchworking looks so good on this bag. I am actually glad I was so limited with the material. I have been using this bag loads already and think it's a great bag for going out for a meal or a shopping trip. It actually fits quite a lot of things and I think it adds so much to an outfit. Two things to be aware of is that one, I have not added any closure to this bag, so technically it is always open, and two, you do have to hold it in your hand when using it as there are no shoulder or crossbody straps attached to it. Anyways, I love it and I still also have lots of this material left over, so if you have any ideas of what I should make with it, feel free to share that in the comments below. And other than that, thank you so much for watching.